Welcome back to Train Signal's VMware vSphere 5 training. You're watching vSphere Auto Deploy lesson. Alright, in this lesson we are going to talk about Auto Deploy. Auto Deploy is one of those new star features of vSphere 5 that is going to make the provisioning of our physical hosts, our physical ESXi hosts, that much more easier. And it's also going to make the maintenance and the management moving forward of those hosts very, very easy as well. So we're going to start off talking about what is auto deploy exactly. I know we've defined it in several lessons, but I want to make sure we fine-tune what is auto deploy and why we should use auto deploy. I want to talk about the auto deploy components, the auto deploy first boot process, because the first boot process is handled in one way and then the subsequent boots are different, so we're going to talk about those. We're going to talk about the infrastructure requirements for auto deploy. We're then going to move on to the installation and configuration tasks. Now, while auto deploy is a very, very cool feature, you're going to quickly notice that its installation and configuration is a little bit cumbersome, right? Now, it is it's the first feature, the first time VMware comes out with this feature. So I'm sure it'll be fine-tuned as we move forward in other versions, but again, that's why we're here, right? We're here to make sure that the installation and the configuration of this product is as easy and seamless to you guys as possible. We're going to talk about, well, how do you do a test and repair? What is a test and repair rules compliance? And this particularly deals with, well, how do you update a particular rule that you have applied against the host if you want to move it, for example, from folder to folder or cluster to cluster? We're going to talk about the auto deploy power CLI commandlets. What are the different commands that you have at your disposal? Then we're going to talk about setting up syslog server and setting up a dump collector. And the reason we need those two components is ESXi is a read-only image, right? You're installing ESXi into memory. As a result, there's nowhere for the syslog to write, there's nowhere for the dump to write. So we got to point them somewhere else so that in the event that you need troubleshooting, you are taking this information from another server rather than losing it because there's nowhere to save it. So as you can see, I have a packed lesson for you guys. It's going to be a lot of fun. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, we're going to talk about what is auto deploy first. So why is this feature important now? Why is VMware coming out with this feature? Now I have the standard, explanation on the screen. I'm not going to read it out to you. But auto deploy is a feature, it's a technology that is going to allow or enable cloud computing, whether it's private clouds or public clouds. Cloud is all about automation. It's all about fast provisioning. It's not about buying a server, putting the components in it, racking it, stacking it, cabling it, installing that's 10, 12 years ago. With cloud, it's I want my server up in 15 minutes. How do you do that? How do you deploy multiple servers? How do you deploy 5, 10, 20, 100 ESXi servers quickly? The idea behind auto deploy is you get these stateless physical hosts that don't have an identity. You plug them into the network, and as long as you've pre-provisioned your infrastructure from a DHCP and reservations and etc., auto deploy will be able to take a particular physical host, detect that, for example, this is an IBM or a Dell or an HP or a Cisco server or Blade. Based on your configuration, it's going to deploy the right ESXi image with the right drivers to this particular hardware. Now it doesn't stop there. Now once it deploys ESXi into memory, then you use host profiles to configure that particular ESXi host and connect it to your virtual center and place it into the right cluster based on all the host profile rules that you want to apply. Subsequent reboots, the same method. If you want to reboot it, all the information is stored within virtual center, so as soon as you reboot that ESXi host again, it'll notice that there's an entry for it in the vCenter database. It knows to connect to this particular image, and it knows to connect to this particular host profile, and it comes right back up. So as you can see, auto deploy is a really cool feature. Now let's start digging into, let's start peeling it back. The auto deploy components. Well, you have an auto deploy server. In our example, what we're going to do here is I'm going to deploy the auto deploy server on the virtual center server. Now, with the auto deploy server, you have the auto deploy rules engine. The auto deploy rules engine, sort of as the name implies, it is what dictates what physical hardware gets what rules and based on what criteria. So again, let's take the example that we've been using. Let's assume you have Cisco blades and you also have IBM blades in the environment, and they're all booting. right? Now, the criteria could be that the Cisco blades are booting off of a particular IP range or an IP subnet, while the IBM blades are booting off of a different IP subnet. So different IP is going to be delivered to them via DHCP. So you can set a rule that says any server, any physical hardware that's coming from this subnet gets the Cisco image with the Cisco drivers and everything pre-built into the ESXi image. And anyone coming from the IBM subnet will get the IBM image, so on and so forth. And you can do the same thing for host profiles so that you're applying the right host profile to the right physical hosts. Now, within the rules engine, there are two types of rules. There's the active rule set, and then there's the working rule set. The active rule set, as its name implies, is an active rule set that is ready to be deployed to physical hosts. When these physical hosts try to boot up and they go through the process, and we'll talk about that in a second, they will detect the active rule set based on the criteria, and it will deploy that active rule set to them. Now, what is the working rule set? The working rule set is a way for you to test a rule before you actually deploy it. So, think of it as like a test area, but you're able to test your work sets against a particular host before you actually put it into production. Then you have your image profiles. So you have the default image profiles, and what I mean by an image profile is a simple executable, a simple, not more than an executable, it's an ISO that allows you to install ESXi. You have the default image profiles. The default image profiles can come from VMware, so this is the same way when you log on to VMware, go to downloads and download your ESXi.ISO. That's what I mean by default images here. Now, because ESXi is a small footprint, it doesn't have all the drivers like ESX. The different hardware manufacturers like Cisco and Fujitsu and IBM and HP, they are going to create these default image profiles that come prepackaged with ESXi and all of their drivers built into them already. So what you can do is you can go to the VMware website, download the plain vanilla ESXi image, or you can get your ESXi image from your vendors, HP again, the whole shebang. Now, the other option is to customize your image profile. You can download the plain vanilla one from VMware, and you can slipstream the drivers that you want into the particular image, thereby creating your own custom image, and then using that image in auto deploy to deploy it to the hardware. So you have a lot of options here. Obviously, the default image one is just a little easier because you don't have to deal with the whole packaging and repackaging process, but depending on your environment, you might want to use one or the other. Host profiles is easy. It's the same thing. It's through vSphere client. We'll go through that, how to create a host profile and attach it to a particular host. Answer files, during the boot process, or the ESXi boot process, any type of user interaction with the boot process, anything that the boot process prompts the user to click OK or say yes here or enter a value, whatever the case might be, all of those are captured within an answer file. It's worth noting here that if an ESXi goes through the process and there's any kind of user prompts that haven't been answered, then that ESXi instance will go into maintenance mode and will remain in maintenance mode in vCenter until the user or the administrator has satisfied the answers before you can put it back into the cluster in full production. Now, what does the auto deploy first boot process look like? Now, why do I put first in there? I put first in there because the first boot process is technically the one that's going to install ESXi into RAM. It's going to register it with vCenter. It's going to create an entry for it. It's going to deploy the right image. It's going to create, or it's going to associate it with the host profile. So that's the first boot process. These steps don't necessarily apply for subsequent boots or reboots because you already have entries in the vCenter database, or all it has to do is check with them and the boot process goes on. So how does this work? So a stateless host that has nothing on it except hardware is going to pixie boot and get an IP address from DHCP. Now keep in mind, auto deploy is very heavy on the infrastructure. It's going to need DHCP of some sort. So it's going to pixie boot. It's going to grab an IP address from DHCP. Ideally, you want to have a reservation for this particular ESX host with a host name, and that host name has to also be configured in DNS with an A record and a pointer record, and I'm going to show you that as well, so that when the host goes through the process and it gets added to vCenter, it's going to get added with its fully qualified domain name. So back to this. Pixie boots, it gets an IP address from DHCP server. DHCP is then going to point this host to the TFTP server via option 66. Now, when we're configuring DHCP, we're going to configure option 66, which is the TFTP server IP address. So DHCP is going to point to the TFTP server. The host is then going to contact the TFTP server and download a gPXE configuration file as specified in option 67. So as we're configuring DHCP, we're going to configure option 66 and 67. 66 points to the TFTP IP address. 67 is the gPXE configuration file that we're going to use. The gPXE config file then instructs the host to make an HTTP boot request to the auto deploy server. The auto deploy then queries the rules engine. We talked about the rules engine a little bit ago for information about this host. You have to tell auto deploy what kind of a host is this. It needs some information so it knows which image to deploy. You can tag it so that it knows this is a Cisco image. You can use an IP range. You can use any number, MAC address, any number of different criteria to identify this host. Once the rules engine identifies what type of host, an image profile and a host profile is attached to the host. So the image profile will deploy the right ESXi5 image to this host. And then as this host starts to boot up and it gets into vCenter, a host profile will also be attached to it. Now after that, ESXi is installed into the host memory. It is added to vCenter and is configured using the host profile. vCenter will maintain the image profile and host profile for each of the hosts in the database, so that again for subsequent reboots it knows that there's an entry for it in the database. Infrastructure requirements. What are we going to need to make this work? Well, we're going to need DHCP. In our case, I'm using Windows Server 2008, DHCP, and DNS. We're going to need two options on DHCP. We're going to need 66 and 67. I talked about those briefly. Again, 66 is a fully qualified domain name or IP address of the TFTP server. And option 67, we're putting in this value. This is the name of the gPXE config file that we need the TFTP server to direct the host to. So you want to make note of this because that's what you want to put in to that value if you're going to follow along with the exercises. Now, depending on how your environment is set up, if there's any kind of router configuration that needs maybe a DHCP helper, something to allow the DHCP broadcast to go through, I just wanted to point it out. You obviously need PXE and you need a TFTP server of some sort. Now, let's talk about the installation and configuration tasks that we're going to cover in this lesson. We're obviously going to install and configure auto deploy. We're going to install and configure a TFTP server. Now, in my case, and I'll show you this in the next slide, we're going to download and use WinAgent's TFTP. You can feel free to use TFTPD. Windows 2008 has a TFTP server, so use whatever TFTP server you're comfortable with. I just find that one a little easier to use. We're going to configure DHCP. We're going to configure DNS. And towards the end of the lesson, we're also going to install and configure the dump collector and the syslog server so that you know how your ESXi that don't have local storage, how they can store the dump and the syslog information. So what are you going to need to follow along? Well, you're going to need the vCenter 5 setup files for sure. You're going to need VMware Power CLI. You're going to need a TFTP server of some sort. Again, we're using WinAgent's TFTP. You need Windows Server 2008, DHCP, and DNS if you want to follow along with exactly what we're doing. You're also going to need the ESXi5 offline bundle. Now, the offline bundle, you can download it off of the VMware website, the same place where you downloaded ESXi5 and vCenter. You're also going to need a host capable of running ESXi5 because as we go through the streaming process, as we go through the auto deploy process, you want to make sure that the hardware compatibility list for the host that you're using can support ESXi configuration. All right, so if you guys are ready, let's go ahead and switch over and start configuring this stuff. All right, so we're on our virtual center server, and the one thing I want you guys to note here is that I'm going to do this exercise on VMware Workstation. And the reason for that is because with VMware Workstation, it allows me to tab between the console of an ESXi server to Windows Server 2008 to Virtual Center a little easier so that I can show you what's going on, for example, on the console of an ESXi server. And since we're going to be doing the auto deploy, I want to be able to switch back and forth between the console. So if you see the mouse go up while I'm changing servers, you know why I'm doing that. So the first thing I want to get out of the way is the infrastructure. So let's go ahead and log on to our Windows Server 2008 domain controller. And while we're at it, I'm going to give Train Signal a shameless plug here, right? So I'm going to be doing a lot of DHCP advanced stuff, some DNS stuff If you are not familiar with Windows Server 2008 or Active Directory for that matter, Train Signal does offer a kick butt Windows Server 2008 course. So make sure you check them out for that as well. So the first thing we're going to talk about is DHCP. So I've already gone ahead and created a DHCP scope for myself. And my DHCP scope is 192.168.2.0 through blah, blah, blah. So when you have that, under the address, under reservations actually, I've also done a reservation for the ESXi host that we're going to use in this exercise. And to do that, it's very simple. I mean, you right click on reservation here, you come down to reservation or new reservation. You're going to give it a name. In my case, it was ESXi or ESX6, just keep the hosts way out of the range of what we're using. So ESX6.wiredbraincoffee.com. I've given it the IP address that I want it to reserve in this case, and here you'd have to put which IP address you want it to reserve. You put in the MAC address, and if you want to do a description, leave these at default. You click OK or click on Add, and it's going to add an entry for you here. Now this is as far as the reservations are concerned. This is important because as soon as you give it a host name, now the next step when we go into DNS, I'll show you how to create an A record so that the host can come up as a fully qualified domain name in Virtual Center. Now the other thing that's very important here is the scope options. So note that there's server options. Those options are going to be server wide on all the scopes, so to speak. And then you have the scope options that are specific to that particular scope. Now I've added option 66 and 67. Adding options is easy. Right click on it and you go to configure options, and then you just select the options by selecting the checkbox, the options that you want to configure. Now once they're in here, option 66, I'm pointing it right now to my Virtual Center server. My Virtual Center server is where I'm going to install my TFTP server. In your environment, the TFTP server might be something else. As a result, this IP address is going to be different than Virtual Center. So in my case, for simplicity, I'm just putting it on Virtual Center. In a real environment, it might be somewhere else. Option 67's value is the value that I showed you during the presentation. This is the file, and I'll show you when we copy it on the TFTP server, that the TFTP server is going to direct the host to download so it knows the next steps in the boot process. So 66 and 67 are very important. Now after you create a reservation for a particular host or two, you want to come into your DNS manager and you want to create an A record. Now you'll note that here I already have an A record for my ESX host, but I do want to point out here that if you right click on your domain and you come down to where it says new host A, I want you to put in the host name, the IP address, and keep in mind you really want to create a PTR or an associated pointer. That's very, very important that you do that for DNS and then reverse DNS to work properly. So this is as far as the infrastructure that you need to have in place to configure and move forward with this. Now again, if you have routers and all that stuff, you want to make sure that the DHCP broadcast is working at the router level. Let's go back to Virtual Center. Now that we have the infrastructure out of the way, the first thing that I want to do is install AutoDeploy. Now to install AutoDeploy, you want to get a hold of the VMware media. I have it on the desktop, and we're going to go through the auto run process, and you'll see that you have access to AutoDeploy. Click on it, and we're going to click on install. I'm going to close the back window here. Let's click OK. The installation of AutoDeploy is relatively straightforward. There's really nothing much to configure here, as you'll see in a second. This is the default directory where it's going to be installed. The AutoDeploy repository maximum size can be of 2 gig. You can increase it if you're going to have multiple images, or depending on the amount of images that you're going to have in the depository. And this is the default directory where it's going to be installed. In our case, we're not going to go over that or change the default location for now. Here you're going to, this is how you link AutoDeploy to your Virtual Center server. So because I'm installing AutoDeploy on my Virtual Center server itself, I'm just going to use localhost. In your case, you can put the IP address of your Virtual Center server if they are not on the same box. A username and password that can connect the Virtual Center, authenticate, and have the right access. So I'm using my administrator with my password, again, just for simplicity reasons here. The auto deploy server port, this is a default unless there's a specific reason I wouldn't change this. How do you want auto deploy to be identified on the network? Again, right now it's just grabbing the IP address of virtual center, so this is how it would be identified. That's the only thing that I have right now, so I'm just going to go ahead and click on next and install. As you can see, it's relatively straightforward. And finish. We're going to exit out of here. Now, before we start Virtual Center and take a look at auto deploy, I also want to go ahead and install my TFTP server. I've also downloaded the TFTP server from WinAgent's TFTP. It's a free 30-day download that you can use if you're doing a test, and if you like it, you can buy it. Or if there's another, you can use TFTPD. If you're one of those network guys, Cisco guys, just love that particular TFTP server, so you can use that as well. Windows 2008 has one, so again, depending on your preference. This is just a straightforward and easy product to use at this point. Next, we agree to the license agreement. We're going to go with a complete installation. Next all the way. And finish. All right, now that we have TFTP installed, let's go ahead and log into Virtual Center and take a look at what changed and where auto deploy was added so that we can move on with the configuration here. Evaluation, yeah. Now the first thing that I want to draw your attention to is I've cleaned up Virtual Center. And the reason I did that is I didn't want anything else in Virtual Center to defocus us or derail us from what we're trying to do, because I want the host to move from folder to cluster and so on and so forth. So I cleaned it up so it doesn't look exactly like the Virtual Center that we've been dealing with, but I did it on purpose for auto deploy to stress a point. Now here what's happening is Virtual Center is trying to make a connection with auto deploy. Again, because this is a self-signed certificate, you're going to get this. In my case, I'm just going to ignore it. In your environment, you might want to get an actual certificate for Virtual Center. Now once you have that, if you click on Home, you'll see that auto deploy hasn't shown up yet, but any second now auto deploy will show up here. And there it is. So once you have auto deploy showed up, we're going to click on it. From a Virtual Center perspective, auto deploy is very, very boring. There's really nothing to do, right? I mean, you could refresh, and then you can download the auto deploy log files or download the TFTP boot zip file. Now, if you click on any of those links and they don't work, or you probably get an error, that's probably because of the Internet Explorer Enhanced Security is enabled on Windows Server 2008 by default. So to disable that, you want to go to your Server Manager. Show you how to do that real quick for those of you that haven't done that before. And you want to come here to down here to where it says Configure IE ESC and just set them both to off. And then that'll allow you to download these two files. Now again, these are the log files, so just in case you need them. Now for us, we've already installed a TFTP server. However, remember that file that we populated in DHCP so that the TFTP server can point to it? Well, now you get it from your auto deploy installation. This is a file that is inside of the zip file, so let's go ahead and download it. And I'm going to save it on the desktop just so we have quick access to it. That's really all there is to it inside of Virtual Center. There's the UI, the user interface. There's nothing really to do here within Virtual Center. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to minimize this real quick. And now that I have my download TFTP zip file, I want to open my TFTP server. So let's go ahead and open that up. WinAgents. You want to log on to the local server, and we do want it to start the TFTP services. Wow. Now this is the root. You want to copy all the files from the zip that you just downloaded into the virtual root. Now if you're using this software to understand or to know where the path is to the virtual root, you can click on server, and we're going to come down here to where it says virtual TFTP folders, manage the repository, and you'll see that it's in C program data WinAgent. So what I'm going to do is click on computer. Now again, if you don't see program data anywhere here, you're going to click on start. You're going to do folder options. And we're going to do view all files, remove the extensions here real quick. Okay, and voila. It shows up in here. We're going to go under WinAgents, TFTP server, TFTP root. Now let's go ahead and minimize this real quick. Open the zip file. We're going to copy all the contents from the zip file. We're going to put them here, and let's close both of them real quick and go back into TFTP. You see that they've shown up under your TFTP server. Remember that file that we put on DHCP option 67? There it is. So this is where it's going to direct it to download this file, so that this file can direct it to continue the boot process. So I'm going to go ahead and exit out of TFTP now. So we have the infrastructure is completely configured at this point. What you want to do is find the host that you want to deploy ESXi to. And before we move any further, I want to test that so far our configuration is sound, right? So the first thing you want to make sure you have is the MAC address of that host. You want to make sure that it's in DHCP as I showed you. You want to make sure that your range and all the reservations and all that is taken care of. Now once you have that, I'm going to power on a host and let's see if our config so far has been successful. As you can see, it got an IP address from DHCP, so all my DHCP is correct. It went to Pixie, so all the Pixie configuration so far is also correct. So it's going to get to a point where it's going to request an image. We don't have an image configured as of yet, so this configuration is going to get to a point where it can't go any further, but you can see that it's going through all the gPXE, all the proper configuration steps that we would expect it to go through. So again, it went through all the process. It doesn't have anything to boot into at this point, so it's not, the configuration hasn't been completed. However, I do know that at least my DHCP is working, my DNS is working, my reservation is working, I have the right MAC address, TFTP is working, all of that is good. So let's go ahead and switch back to Virtual Center. Now at this point, what I need is Power CLI. I've already downloaded PowerCLI, and the way to get to PowerCLI is again through the VMware website. You can go to VMware.com through the regular download your VMware PowerCLI executable. I've put it here on the desktop, and for time purposes, I've already installed it. There's really nothing particularly interesting to see about the PowerCLI installation. It's just next all the way. Now, once you've installed it, you want to first launch PowerCLI. You'll see that you have two icons. You have one for 64-bit and you have one for 32-bit, so depending on the operating system you can use that. I'm going to go ahead and use the one that says Power CLI for 64-bit, so I'm just going to go with this. Alright, so the first thing we want to do is we want to enable the execution of commandlets within Power CLI. So for security reasons, Microsoft, is security conscious these days, and it won't allow some of these Power CLI commandlets to be enabled unless you enable the execution policy. So I'm gonna show you how to do that, and I have it pre-prepared here. So we're going to do set-execution policy unrestricted, and you're going to say yes to that. And as soon as that loads up, then we're good to go. I like to close and reopen it, and I'll show you why here in a second. And this is the reason why. It sort of gives me that comfort level that the Power CLI is working. It shows me some of the commands that are available to me, etc., etc. Now, the first thing I want to do is I want to show you this command, and even though it's going to be a little redundant from a show you perspective, I'm going to show you this inside of the presentation when we switch back to it. But these are some of the commands or the commandlets that you can run within Power CLI to control auto deploy. So I just wanted to give you an idea of what you can do to run that. And again, the command is get-deploy command. So that's just an easier way of doing it. Now, before we can move forward, we want to connect to our vCenter server. So we want to be able to connect from Power CLI to our vCenter server. And to do that, we are going to run the following command. Connect-vi server, and then I'm going to do a space. My virtual center server is called vcenter5.wiredbraincoffee.com. All right, so we've properly established the connection to our vCenter server. Now you'll see that I have a warning message, so to speak, here, and that warning message is just the SSL certificate. Again, because it's a self-signed certificate, if you want to avoid the message, then you probably want to either get it signed by the local certificate authority on your domain or get one from like a VeriSign or a GoDaddy or something like that. All right, so we've established a connection to our virtual center server from our Power CLI, so we're ready to go. Remember when I told you to download that offline bundle for ESX? So what you want to do is you want to create a place, a location somewhere that's easily accessible from Power CLI where you point it to the offline bundle. Now keep in mind, the offline bundle isn't the auto deploy repository. It is just a directory that I'm recommending that you create, and you put the offline bundle there, or any other VIBs or anything else that you download from manufacturers that have customized VIBs. You put them there, and then you have to run commands in order to import them into the auto deploy repository, as I'm going to show you. So here's what I've done. Under my computer, again for testing purposes, I've created a directory called VIBs. Under that, I've just basically downloaded from VMware.com the offline package, and you'll notice that it's got, it's a depot.zip. So if you're trying to download it, this is what it looks like. Once you have it in this directory or any other directory of your choosing, you can come into Power CLI. Now we want to import that into auto deploy repository, and to do that we're going to use the command add-esx-software depot, and I'm using quotes because there's spaces, the full location to that particular directory and the file name, that I have in there. Once you have that, we're going to click on enter, and voila, it has now imported that particular image that we have into its repository. All right, now we want to take a look at what images are in this repository. Right now I happen to have just one, just because we've imported it, but I'm trying to show you here as many commands as I can, just so you know and learn these commands, whether you're taking the VCP5 test or just so you know them in the future from an administrative perspective, once you have done more than just one, how to find what's in your repository. So again, we're going to use the command get-esx image profile. And voila. These are right now the images that I have in my repository, in my auto deploy repository. What I want to do is I want to take this particular image, the standard image that I have here, and I want to use that to deploy it to my ESX host. Now, in order to do that, I also, as part of that, I want to make sure that my ESX host is connected into a folder in vCenter called staging, because I don't want to add it right away into my cluster. I want to make sure it gets added into staging first. I want to make sure everything's okay, and then we can run other commands to move it into the production cluster. So I want to take you one step at a time through all of these. So let's go ahead and get that command as well. And before we click enter, let's go ahead and dissect this command. So the command is new-deploy rule. So we're creating a new rule, right? Now I want to give this rule a name. What is the name of this rule? It's called staging. And the reason it's called staging is because I want this ESX host to be deployed in my staging area first, and it's a folder in vCenter that I have created. So if you go under vCenter hosts and clusters, you want to make sure you have that created ahead of time. So it's called staging right now. And I want you to deploy -item means I want you to deploy this particular ESXi image, which I have in the repository, and I'm copying it word for word in quotations. And I want you to deploy it into the staging folder in my virtual center. You'll notice that there's a comma and then there's a staging folder. Now -pattern. The pattern is the criteria against which you want this to be applied. This criteria can be a MAC address, it could be tags that you've assigned, associated, or created. It could be a range of IP addresses. So you can have your DHCP range. Let's say it's, in my case, it's 192.168.2.70 through 80. And then later, when I show you some other commands, I'll show you how to use the range. We'll use the range instead of the MAC address. But again, to show you the full swing of things, we're going to use the MAC address of the host to create this particular rule. So when I'm ready, I'm going to click on enter. And it's going to start processing this command, adding it to creating the rule set, etc., etc. So this will take a few seconds here. And the upload into the repository is complete. All right, so we've uploaded everything into the repository. We've created a root, a rule. We're all ready. Am I missing anything? Anyone? Bueller? During the presentation, I mentioned something. Anything else? Yes, we have to add the rule to the active set rules. Otherwise, it won't take effect. So to do that, what we're going to do, we're going to use the following command, which is add-deploy rule-deploy, and then the rule name that we just created. And as you can see, after it finished uploading everything and the rule was created and everything, it gave you sort of a summary of that particular rule. So its name, the MAC address that it's associated with, the image that it's associated with, and the particular folder or cluster for that matter in Virtual Center that it's going to be added to. So the comma and then whatever is after it, that could be a host profile, it could be the folder, it could be a cluster. So now let's make this part of the active rule set. I'm going to go ahead and click on OK, and voila. Now I'm going to reset my host and see if anything changes. Technically, it should boot right into ESXi and start the installation. So let's see if we did this right. Contacting the HCP, Pixie is going well. And there you have it. It is going to start the configuration of ESXi into the memory of this particular physical host that you are deploying. It'll take a few minutes, but it'll install it. After it installs it here into memory, it will then make it available, or assign it or attach it inside of Virtual Center in a folder called staging that we have created ahead of time. And would you take a look at that? Tell me this is not a thing of beauty. This is really cool. There you go. Now take a look at this. It has already IP'd it. We are good to go. Now let's go ahead and switch back to Virtual Center and see if it added it in Virtual Center properly. We're going to go ahead and take a look, and I can see a plus sign here, so I know something is in there. Take a look at that. Tell me that is not cool. So right now, what we've done is we've added our ESXi host into the staging folder. The staging folder is our staging location before we actually move it into our production cluster. So it's going to take a few seconds here just to finish adding the host, etc., etc. But once it's added, then we can start creating a host profile for it, and the next step, we can move it into a particular cluster if we wanted to do so. And voila, there you go. So we now have added the ESXi host into our Virtual Center in a folder called staging. Now, technically, let's assume that we have a cluster in here called prod. This is our production cluster, and we want to be able to, after we've done our configuration to our host, after we get a host profile out of it, we want to move it into production. Now, the first thing I want to do is I want to create a host profile out of this. So let's assume you make all your configuration changes, you create an NTP server, you have the server exactly the way you want it. You're going to right click on it, come down here where it says host profile, and we're going to create a profile from this particular host. Now I'm going to call this ESX6 just for giggles, ESXi6 for authenticity. And I'm also going to attach that particular host profile to this server. Now to do that, we're going to put the server in maintenance mode first. So we're going to right click on it, enter maintenance mode. Yes, please. Once the server is in maintenance mode, we're going to right click, we're going to drag down to host profile, we're going to apply profile. And yes, please apply, finish. Thank you very much. So now that we've applied, or we're in the process of applying the host configuration profile to this ESX host, what we've done so far is we've Pixie booted, we've created an image entry, profile entry for this host in vCenter. We've now created a host profile entry for this host in Virtual Center as well. So now it's very easy for us to reboot this host or do whatever we need to do to it. First thing I want to do is I want to take it out of maintenance mode now that we have completed everything that we want to do to it. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to move it from staging and into production, into my prod cluster. So let me show you how we do that as well. All right, so let's bring back Power CLI. Now the first thing I want to do here is you can't modify a rule that is already active. You have to copy that rule and then make the modifications and the changes you want. So we're going to use this particular command. We're going to copy -deploy rule space -deploy rule. It's staging. That's the name of the rule that we have. And what we want to change here is we want to replace item. Instead of staging, we want to go with prod for our production cluster. So I'm going to click on enter to execute. And the enter command has executed and is already taken. So you can see that the replacement has already taken place here in my working set at this point. It's not my active set at this point because I've made a copy, right? So it's prod has taken effect. The next thing I want to do is I want to verify my host access. Now this is a command, and some of these commands that I'm showing you, you can choose to use or not at a later time. But you want to be able to modify or to verify the host accessibility. Can you attach to this particular host? Now to do that, we are going to run the following command. And the command is get-vmhost space -name and the name of the fully qualified domain of the ESX host that you want to verify. I'm going to click on enter, and voila. You'll see that it immediately verified that there's connectivity, this host is good, so on and so forth. So now we're ready to test this particular configuration. Again, I'm showing you all these commands that you might use or you might skip over sometimes once this become redundant and you're used to it. Now the interesting thing about what we're doing with how we test here, and I want to draw your attention to it, is you'll see we're using an environmental variable here, $TR. So we're going to use this environmental variable in the next command. So we're going to issue the test right now to see, this is going against our working set, to see if everything would work properly. So I'm going to go ahead and click on enter. And voila, it executed without any issues. Well, now that we know that this is valid and I'm ready to make my change, the last command to remediate is going to look as follows. Now it's called repair -deploy. It's not really it's not really repairing anything, but this is VMware's way of saying you're about to modify this. Now, as soon as I pasted it, it immediately took effect. So you'll see in the background here that it already moved it out of the staging folder, so the staging folder has nothing in it now, and into the production cluster, into prod as a production cluster. So this is how you move them back and forth between your folders and apply any kind of a particular profile to your ESXi host. Now you'll see that this is very straightforward. After you do it a few times, it becomes easy. But these are the different commands, and this is how you're able to manipulate auto deploy. Now, before we move back to our presentation so I can share with you a few more things, what do you guys say we get rid of, or we get through some of the configurations and installations that are left here, which we still have the dump collector and the syslog collector that we need to install. So to do that, let's go ahead and minimize vCenter, and let's also minimize our Power CLI. Let's go back in and get the auto run for Virtual Center. Let's close the background. Kind of annoying. And let's start with the dump collector here. I'm going to click on install. Next, I agree, next. Default locations, next. We're going to do a standard installation or a standalone installation at this point. Default dump server port. Unless there's a need to change it, you don't need to change it. This is how it identifies itself on the network. Now I'm putting it on my virtual center. As a result, that's where it will go and install. There's really nothing to it from an installation perspective. And finish. Now let's do the same thing for syslog here. Next, next, I agree, next. Same kind of information. Again, the log rotation to be kept, the size, default locations. Next, we're going to do standalone. Again, all of the default ports here, unless you see a need to change these ports, these should be left the way they are. What are you collecting, etc. Again, how it identifies itself on the network, and install. Now, while this is installing, when I flip back to the presentation, I'm going to share with you some of the ESX CLI commands that you can use with the dump collector and with the syslog collector. However, if you're like me, I don't know what this craze is about this. Oh, we want to use Power CLI, Microsoft, Citrix, VMware. Everyone's creating these Power CLI things, and you got to type and remember all these commands. And I'm like, look, I'm a visual person. If there's a GUI to do it, don't bother me. I mean, for all intents and purposes, auto deploy should have been a GUI inside a virtual center. I don't know why there's so many commands that we have to jump hoops through, but hopefully in the next iteration. But now that we've installed both of these services on Virtual Center, you can control their behavior from the host profile itself or from command line. Now I'm going to show you how to do it from host profile, and when we flip to the presentation, I'll show you how to do it, or I'll show you the commands on how you can do it if you want to use ESX CLI. Let's go ahead and get out of the auto run here and get back into Virtual Center. And we're going to go back to home here, and we're going to select host profiles. And we're going to right click and click on edit profile. Now, the first thing I want to show you is where you modify the core dump collector stuff, and that'll be under networking configuration. And then network core dump settings, you can expand that. Select it. And then once you selected it, you can click on edit, and these are the information that you would have to put in here. So the first thing you want to do is, obviously, you want to enable or disable it, so you want to enable it. You want to select the host NIC to use, so you could do like, for example, VMK0 if you want to use the default service console or the virtual switch, where the default virtual NIC that comes with it. The network core dump server IP address, in my case, would be my virtual center server IP address. The network core dump server port, you'd specify the port, any particular port. If it's the default port, you can put that in as well. So the default port, for example, would be 6500 unless you've modified it, and you can put in the IP address of your virtual center server or wherever you have it pointing to. In my case, it would be 192.168.2.52. So that's as far as the core dump configuration is concerned. Now, if you guys want to do this through command line, I'll show you how to do that as well. Now let's go and move on to syslog. Syslog is located in a different area, and it's located under the advanced settings. So if you expand that, you'll notice that you have all of these syslog configurations that you can go through in order to configure syslog. And what is it, what do you want it to save, where do you want it to save it, what's the rotation going to look like, etc., etc. What directory, what's the size of the directory. You have a ton of options here on how to customize and configure syslog to meet your particular needs. However, that's all there is to it from an auto-deployed configuration and installation, a syslog, all that good stuff. So I still have some more things I want to share with you, so let's go ahead and flip back to our presentation and finish this off. All right, so we went through this exercise when we were updating our rule so that we moved it from staging into our production cluster. But I wanted to also display for you on screen here, just in case you needed a refresher of what we did, the steps that we did them, and why we did certain things the way we did them. So the first thing would be to make changes to our rule. Obviously, you can't make changes to an active rule, so you have to copy it using the copy command, and we changed from staging to prod, as you can see here. Then we moved to verify host accessibility. We wanted to make sure that the host that we were going to try to copy this rule against is accessible, so we did that as well with using this particular command. Then we tested it using the environmental variable that we created here against the test results, and then what we did is we remediated that particular host by running the repair tool, and you'll see that the environmental variable is here as well. Now, these are some of the auto-deploy Power CLI commands. We've used most of them. However, I just wanted to list some others just in case you were curious about what else you have. Now, anytime you need more information about a particular command, you can use the get help with the commandlet name here. Or if you want more advanced or detailed help on it, you can do the get help with the commandlet with a dash detailed, and it'll give you more information about all of these commands. Again, we've used most of them. However, if there's any one in particular that you wanted to get more information about, I invite you to run that particular help. Now, and these are a continuation again of some of them. Again, for the most part, we've used the better part of all of them, most of the ones that you're going to be using on a day-to-day basis for sure. All right, so setting up syslog server. So I showed you how to do that from a host profiles perspective. Now, if you wanted to do that from a command line based perspective, you can always use ESX CLI, system syslog, and configure syslog that way. However, if you're like me and there's a lot of these syslog configurations that have to be changed, I like to use it via host profiles. I just find it easier. Now, setting up dump collector, again, we did it through host profiles, very easy, very straightforward. But if you wanted to make the same configuration changes that we did in our GUI, then you can feel free to follow along here with ESX CLI system core dump network, etc. We specify VMK0, and then you go through the IP addresses and all that good stuff to get that done. And that's all there is to it, folks. So let's go ahead and recap what we've learned in this really cool lesson. So we started off by talking about what is auto deploy. We defined auto deploy, and that auto deploy makes it easy to provision one or more physical hosts from a stateless state into a fully usable, functional host, ESXi host within your virtual center cluster. We talked about how it PXE boots, grabs an IP address, DHCP points it to a TFTP, TFT points it to a file, that a gPXE configuration file that it downloads. It installs ESXi based on a set of criteria: MAC address, IP address range, make or model of the particular host, and it deploys an ESX host. Then with host profiles, it adds it to virtual center, adds it into your cluster, and puts it into production. We then talked about the different auto deploy components. We talked about the auto deploy server, the rules engine. We talked about the fact that you have a working sets rule and you have an active rule, and the active is what is active today, and the working set is what you can use against it. We went through the different components that are required for auto deploy. We talked about syslog, and we talked about the core dumps as well. We then moved on to auto deploy first boot process. We talked about the difference between the first boot process and subsequent boots, and the fact that the first boot process is the ones that's going to create an entry in Virtual Center for the image profile that was used and the host profile that was used, so that any subsequent reboots, it has an entry. Virtual Center has an entry for these hosts within it, and it automatically uses those. We then talked about the infrastructure requirements. You're going to need THCP, you're going to need TFTP, you need PXE, you need router configurations to be in place. From a DHCP perspective, you want to make sure option 66 and 67 are in place. 66 points to TFTP server. 67 is the config file that it downloads. We also talked about the fact that you need to have DNS available and working as well. We went through the different installation and configuration tasks that we did later on, and we configured auto deploy. We installed auto deploy. We configured TFTP, DNS, DHCP, the whole shebang. Then we, during the demonstration portion of the lesson, after we added the host into the staging area, we used the test and repair rules compliance approach to move it from the staging area into the production area, and we used the environmental variables and all that good stuff. I showed you a bunch of auto deploy power CLI commands that you can use. We used most of them during this lesson, but I also made available to you some of the other ones that you can find useful. And we went ahead and set up syslog server. We also set up the dump collector, and in both cases we configured them using the host profile, but I also showed you how you can configure them using Power CLI. Finally, I hope this lesson was very informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.